as you can see, the Giants are going to the World Series. Lots of, huh? Yeah. And Marx is really difficult, but really great. I consider those two on a par with each other as important statements. So pay real attention today, and I think you'll come out really understanding where Marx is coming from and what it is he's trying to do. So I want to start with what is really a very complicated problem in Marx, a very, I think, deep issue, which is why does the proletariat rebel? And if you've been paying attention, as you read the Communist Manifesto, I'm going to go over some of these passages in class today, you should already have some arguments about that. So Marx makes very clear, for example, that capitalism impoverishes the proletariat, that it destroys the family, it destroys religion, and so forth. And so we'll see that. But that is not a very good explanation of why the proletariat rebels. And so think back to my very sketchy, reduced, simplified explanation of why the bourgeoisie rebelled against the feudal order at the beginning of the capitalist period. So think back to last lecture, and you could say in that system there were three classes. I'm just going to very sketchily call them the nobles, who were the great landed figures, right? Whoops. I'm left-handed, and even at my left-handed best, I don't write very well. So the nobles, there were the oppressed serfs. Whoops. And the nobles include the knights and warriors and kings and all those people. And then there was this rising bourgeoisie, right? And you all have to master, okay, I can't even write bourgeoisie here. You all have to master the language this far. The proletariat, everybody knows how to spell that word, it's not a familiar English word, is the working class, and the adjective is proletarian, so it was a proletarian movement. The class is the proletariat. An individual person in that class could be called a proletarian, although that term is almost never used. And the bourgeoisie, which actually is a word that comes from the word, you know, like Pittsburgh, the word burg, bourg, city. So bourgeoisie is actually originally the class that emerged in the cities in the medieval period. They were the ones who lived in the burg, if you want to talk about it that way. And that word is a French word, so proletariat must originally be a Latin word, but bourgeoisie is a French word, and it means the capitalist class. So we use it to mean sort of broadly the middle class. She's so bourgeois, right? Would be a statement about somebody's style of dress or something like that. But the bourgeoisie is the class, B-O-U-R-G-E-O-I-S-I-E, and bourgeois, B-O-U-R-G-E-O-I-S, is the adjective. Okay, so you just have to, in your mind, be able to translate proletariat means worker, working class, and bourgeoisie means capitalist class. That's how Marx is using it. Okay, now, during the feudal period, the really oppressed class were the serfs. And did they rebel? No. They were, in some sense, dependent on this system. They fought actually to keep their land as communal land, or as, you know, their hereditary claims to the land. Occasionally they may have joined movements to free workers to be able to work for the bourgeoisie, but otherwise they weren't the revolutionary class. The revolutionary class was this rising class, the bourgeoisie, who were developing this new set of forces of production within the old social relations of production until the forces of production became too powerful and were being held back by the old system, and they burst the fetters asunder. So why in the world would Marx believe that under capitalism, it was the oppressed class, indeed the really oppressed class, the class who's been stripped of everything, their tools, their families, their wages, they're immiserated down to the lowest possible level? Why does he believe that they are going to be the revolutionary class? So in a way, the whole point of this lecture will be to answer that question. But to really answer it, we have to go back and understand Marx more deeply. And I was saying to one of the GSI's, Cyrus Dune, as we walked over, that Marx is hard to read and hard to teach because he's got a lot of different things going on, but they all turn out to fit together in one totally coherent argument. Weber's easier in certain ways because Weber's got a lot of different things going on, and they just stay separate. Whereas for Marx, there are different things going on, and they all fit into one coherent, big picture. And I'm going to try to show you that picture. So, in order to understand why the proletariat rebels, even though it is the most oppressed class, we have to start with Marx's theory of alienation. And that's why I made you read those few pages from the German ideology, which I agree are totally weird, like text from outer space created by a random word generator or something from probably most of your points of view. But in fact, this is some of the most important and really brilliant stuff ever. So I'm going to tell you, and then I want you to go back and read it again and admit that you now understand it at least a little. I think that would make me so happy. Now, oops, I have lost the eraser. Just a second. There. Okay. So I'm sorry to use the board, but I can't figure out how to draw these things on slides. So Marx's theory of alienation is really fundamental. In the reading you're doing, he calls it estrangement. Sometimes it's the same word. And I want to first just talk about what the word alienation means. So we think of alienation as, oh God, I feel lonely and nobody cares about me and I'm having a bad day and I feel so alienated, out of touch with things. But that is not really what alienation, it's just not what the word means. To alienate someone is to drive them away, right? You have someone close to you, but you alienate, or I hope this never happens, but I'm alienated from my parents would mean I don't call them, I don't go to see them. I've got alienated from my friend means I stopped seeing her. I got alienated from the class, and so I stopped going. So it implies that something that was close to you gets pushed far from you. But it means something even more. And what does it mean when we say we are in the Constitution or the Declaration of Independence? Declaration of Independence says we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights. That means they are rights you own that you cannot give away or sell. That's what inalienable means, that they belong to you and you cannot give them away or sell them. So, alienable property is property you can sell, and inalienable property, like your own body, legally, you cannot sell it. And that's what makes chattel slavery so horrendous to us. Because this inalienable possession of your own body, your own freedom, your own person, was bought and sold like alienable property. And we feel that just crosses some fundamental moral divide. Okay, so why is Marx talking about alienation? And here I have to really get you to understand this. For Marx, human history is the history of humankind's mastery of nature. So his view is that primitive people lived basically like beasts, terrified of wild animals, of drought, of storms, of floods, of disease, of starvation. Their children died. They died. They were conquered by who knows what. They were, I mean, so if you think about the vast history of humankind, I always think about this as a parent. People are biologically capable of having 12, 14, 16, 18 children, a woman during her biological lifetime. People were lucky if they had 2 surviving children. That barely kept human populations going. Many populations died out. Human beings were born to a life of unremitting toil, terror, and suffering. Now, not always in little bands. Sometimes they had enough, you know, nature would be good to them one year and they'd all sit around and chat. But the next year they might all be wiped out. And so if you think of Marx's understanding of human history, it is that over human history, human beings' power, so this dimension is power, and this dimension is time, from the beginning, whenever that is, to now. And I know those of you who are on that side can't see that I just wrote now on the board, but I really did. Okay, so human beings' power as humanity has grown, and I'm sure there are bumps in the road, but it has grown exponentially over human history. Especially, I will say, there are some measures of things like energy use per capita and stuff, especially in the modern period, so it sort of looks like this and then like that. But for him, human beings have achieved incredible amounts, and I want you to have a sense of that. And in fact, Marx would say, you have achieved an incredible amount. That is, look at us. First of all, we are warm and dry in this room, basically no matter what is happening out there. This is a recently renovated building, thanks to this wonderful person whose name's on the outside, which I can't remember exactly the name, but what? Anybody remember? Anyway, that some wonderful donor has made this building earthquake secure, so that even the ravages of nature that in earlier historical eras terrorized people, we just don't worry about them. And on the whole, we don't worry about getting sick and dying. Now, it happens occasionally. One or the other of you may have lost a parent very young. This does happen. And we're completely shocked and horrified and devastated because we just don't expect this. I see in Malawi, my friends there who are beneficiaries of most of modern public health, nonetheless, you hear their stories. Oh yeah, my mother died at 36 of a stroke. You know, yeah, my father died. I was in the middle of middle school, and so I had to drop out of school because my mother had to sell buns in the market. It's normal. This was life. This was what most people, and Malawians have it good compared to people through most of human history. It's so recent, in fact, that we have this mastery of nature, mastery of, to a significant extent, life and death. So you look at this, this is incredible. Your computer here, your cell phone, your clothing, the eyeglasses that allow you to see if you were born with horrible nearsightedness, farsightedness, the surgery that might have allowed you to use LASIK and you can see even though you don't have weren't born with good vision. The fact that none of you, almost, are walking around with something like clubfoot. These are, I just cannot enough underline that. Look at these desks and their nice little swivel things and the paper you write on and the pens you write with. Most human beings during most of human history had nothing to write on. It just wasn't possible. Paper or papyrus or parchment were incredibly valuable things that only a few people could ever have access to. And you have billions of words. I would have said, you know, in these beautiful books that are inexpensive and everything, like our amazing Marx Engels reader. is a testimony to the glories of capitalism. Amazing. I have to say, only probably a capitalist system could have produced. It's ripping you off also because the copyright on this is ridiculous. But anyway, whatever you paid for this book, it's a bargain. It's an amazing bargain. But now you can get most of this free online. I mean, it's just, so I would like you to go to the top of the Campanile and look out and look at the freeways and look at the planes going through the sky and look at the buildings and look at what you have built. And Marx wants you to know that this civilization is you, cooperative humankind. You built this thing. And your power, your collective power, has grown amazingly through human history. So what is wrong? What's the problem? The problem is that human beings have increased their power. He uses various terms for this, not socially, but not voluntarily, not freely, but they have increased their power in alienated form. That is, it's your power. You have it, you built it, you created it, but you cooperate. Why? Because some noble is saying, you've got to work in the fields and generate a surplus so that I can have my mounted knights who are vastly superior to you ride out and defeat the barbarians, and once they've done that, then they ride out and do jousting and play games and stuff like that. Or you get to go to work. Why? Because it makes profit for a capitalist. So this whole enormous social power you've built up is conditioned on powerlessness in relation to other human beings. So your power in relation to other human beings, and again, miracle, chalk, right here, blackboards. People don't have things. I mean, it's just, to me, if you don't appreciate civilization, you don't appreciate the glories of capitalist achievement, you don't understand Marx. You can't understand him for 1 minute if you don't see the miraculous, the incredible achievement of human cooperative labor. But that cooperative labor has meant, so in this primitive condition, human beings didn't have much power over each other. So if you look at the relationship between man and man, between human and human, Marx would say man and man, but we understand that he meant humankind. He did not mean men as in masculine men. Mankind, humankind, human beings were powerful in relation to each other, and that has been, again, not steady, but in his view, human beings' power in relation to other human beings has declined. So we have these enormous achievements in alienated form, meaning our power, the power that belongs to us as collective social labor, is exercised not on our behalf, but over us. And the paradox, you can see it really clearly in your actual circumstances here in this room, which is there is this enormous wealth out there, there is this enormous civilization of which you are very privileged beneficiaries, by the way, and you couldn't be here if you weren't. You may be privileged by hard work, and you may have come from very poor refugee families who suffered devastating losses, and you may have grown up in the poorest tenement in the Tenderloin of San Francisco, but on the general scale, if you're here right now, you are enormously privileged, and yet you inherit this enormous achievement of humankind, and yet you live in abject fear that you will not get a job. And if you do not get a job, you could be homeless, hungry, sick, cold, unable to protect those you love. You could be so all this is yours, says Marx. But because that social achievement has occurred in alienated form, as forms of cooperation imposed on you from the outside by exploiters. And Marx sees people's cultural beliefs, that the authorities are superior, that the noble has to be respected, that God wants you to be ruled by your Lord, that law says that the land belongs to him and not you, that the law says that the corporation owns your job, and so if they don't have work for you, you're unemployed. So he sees this contrast between the enormous achievements of social humankind and the abject powerlessness of human beings who are alienated from their own possession. That is yours. But you can't freely have access to it because you cooperate with all these other human beings on the planet, but you do it as part of an alienated system in which you work, you contribute to cooperative social labor only if a capitalist makes a profit. And the capitalist is doing something very important. The capitalist is organizing social cooperation. That's good. But because the capitalist himself, in Marx's terms, is driven of necessity by profit, he cannot, even the most generous, wonderful, warm-hearted, loving, pro-social capitalist who took Ann Swidler's class 20 years ago and believes in human social cooperation, will go out of business if she cannot earn a profit. So her power, her ability to organize social cooperation can exist under capitalism, says Marx, only in alienated form. Okay, now what does this have to do with species being? This is one of the most kind of mysterious, important, amazing passages in Marx, and I'm going to go over it because I'm sure you read it and either thought it was just bizarre or you misunderstood it. So the passage is on page 75. I think we read it, but if we didn't, I'm going to read it to you. This is where Marx says, man is a species being, not only because in practice and in theory he adopts the species as his object, his own as well as those of other things, but, and this is only another way of expressing it, because he treats himself as the actual living species, because he treats himself as a universal and therefore a free being. Now, what is he talking about? What in the world is, if you really understand that sentence, you basically can unlock any part of Marx you want. Now, what does it mean to be a species being? First of all, it does not mean that we have human nature. He is not talking about human nature. He's not talking about human beings basically need freedom or need work or need this or that. That's not what he's talking about. Then he would say man has a species being, something like that. That would mean like he has a certain kind of species nature. But he says man is a species being. And what does he mean by that? Well, I sometimes point to my dog, now several years deceased, but my son and daughter-in-law have acquired 2 puppies, so I could talk about the puppies. And I had dogs almost my whole life, so I know them very well. So I'll talk about my dog that I did have, whose name was Samson, and before that, Moisha. Okay, so Samson. Samson certainly is part of a species, and he was highly aware of his connection to his species. That is, if he went out of the house, or I think even if he was in the house, he could smell 0.00001% of some other dog's pee from miles away and be extremely enthralled and fascinated in finding out what other dogs had passed by and whether he could pee the same place they had peed and whether he could smell their existence, and he was just hugely interested, and any other dogness was of great fascination to him, so he was very connected to his species. And he has species characteristics also, that is, cheerful wagging tail and great nose and instinct to be part of a pack and therefore to intensely bond to whoever he decided was his owner and so forth. So he had all these species characteristics. And we have a bunch of species characteristics as well, including being a lot smarter than Samson, who wasn't at the high end of dog brilliance. Anyway, he would have had to go to a very, very minor dog college because he wouldn't have done well on the dog SATs. But nonetheless, in what sense is he not a species being? Because Samson could not identify with all of dog kind and care about what happened to dogs in general. That wasn't his. Other particular dogs, great enthusiasm. Some, aggressive enthusiasm and some positive enthusiasm, mainly positive. But that's not what Marx is talking about. To be a species being, and he thinks basically only human beings are species beings, means that you can identify with all of humankind, that you can see yourself as linked directly to humanity, that you can understand yourself as the inheritor and in some sense the possessor of these achievements, that you are part of humanity. So when you care about the life of human beings in faraway places, when you care about dying babies in some famine somewhere, when you care about the human rights of women in Pakistan, when you care about, this is a sign of your being a species being. That means you can be part of a universal humanity, right? Not just your little particular world and you with your friends and you wish you could get more money from your job or you this and that and will you get, but part of you at least can identify with all of humankind. And that's what it means to be a species being. So I'm going to go back and just read this sentence again and see if it makes more sense. Man, and here he means humankind, is a species being, not only because in practice and in theory he adopts the species as his object. That means you can love, you can care about, you can be committed to, not just your own little destiny, but that of humankind. And so his own as well as those of other things. And here I think he means you can also identify with nature and with the planet and with animal species that are going to be destroyed, right? You can take my dog cannot care about the destruction of the whales. You can't. All right. But, and this is only another way of expressing it, but also because he treats himself as the actual living species. In other words, he treats himself not just his own little private life, but he treats himself as a human being who's connected to other human beings. He treats himself as a universal and therefore a free being. So universal for him is a hugely important word. It means you're not just your own little particular life, but you are connected to all life in a general way. So then you can see the tragedy here and the potential for a transformative change in the way Marx sees it as the fact that while a unified humankind is becoming ever more cooperative, they're developing social labor, because their labor is, and here I'm going to use terms I'm not really going to talk about, but I hope you talked about them in section, because their labor is naturally divided, meaning caveman A bops cavewoman B over the head and forces her to do certain tasks, or capitalist A employs worker B, squeezing as much work out of her as he possibly can, but also forcing her to cooperate in certain ways. Human beings' universal humanity is growing, but their experience is increasingly of sort of privatized fear, isolated individual. Will I be able to achieve anything for myself? Am I in competition with other workers? And so forth. So we are not just alienated from the material wonders we've created. we are alienated from the increasingly universal humanity in which we live. Okay, so now, what is Marx's historical story? And here I'm going to turn to your text, and you need to memorize, not really, but you need to study with extraordinary intensity the passages of the Communist Manifesto that start on page 475. They are some of the richest, most interesting sociology. I won't even mention how amazing Marx is, writing in whatever, 1848 or whenever this was written, 1847, somewhere right in there. So I'm going to go to page 475 in your Marx Engels reader, and I know you don't have the physical book. You have the photocopied extracts, although if you're going to stay in sociology and you're going to take Soc 201, you're going to own this book, I promise you. So page 475, starting there for about the next 3 pages, is just amazing. And it is here. What is the role of capitalism in this historical story? It plays an incredibly important role for Marx. So he starts this passage with the remarkable statement. So again, 475, I'm about 2/3 of the way down the page. The bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. Now, he doesn't say the proletariat historically has played a most revolutionary part. No, no, no. He says the bourgeoisie, the capitalist, historically has, so the bourgeoisie as a class, the capitalist class, has played a most revolutionary part. What does he mean by that? You can just go paragraph by paragraph, and you should, in a study group with your GSI or by yourself, go paragraph after paragraph and see what he means by this. It's just incredibly important, but I will give you a couple of examples. So he starts, the very next paragraph, the very first sentence, usually the punchline is in the first sentence of each paragraph, not always, but it's somewhere in the paragraph. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his, quote, natural superiors, close quote, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. Well, that sounds really bad, like capitalism is really bad. And this whole set of passages is a huge indictment of capitalism. It strips the worker of this and that, but at the same time, it is about people being transformed by being liberated from the things that keep them down. So deference to your, quote, natural superiors, the belief that the boss loves you and is loyal to you, the belief that the feudal lord is going to take care of you if you get sick, the belief that your employer is naturally better than you. And he says capitalist relations grind that down so that pretty soon you recognize he's not loyal to you, and says Marx, you don't have to be loyal to him. Well, that might increase your chance of rebelling, right? If capitalism grinds down so it destroys loyalty, so you realize your employer would as soon fire you as look at you if efficiency demanded the next step, and Marx believes that sort of the competition of capitalism inevitably pushes employers to do this. So destroying the bonds that tie people to their superiors is a way of freeing them up for revolution in Marx's thinking. But it also is a way of bringing them closer to participation in their species being. Why? Because instead of being a particular kind of worker, oh, I've got my job in a really nice place, and so I don't need to identify with other workers because my boss is really good to me, so I don't need to join a union, or I don't need to see my interests as common with everyone else because I've got a really good deal, I've got a really nice boss, she's really great to me, she gives us extra paid vacation, or she would never fire me. Marx says, as these things get destroyed, you become more of a universal worker because you don't have a particular loyalty to a particular boss, right? So it does both those things. It oppresses you more, it frees you from the ties that sort of bind you to the society, and it universalizes you, meaning it strips away the particular things that make you a different kind of person than everyone else, and instead leaves the part that makes you a universal human being who can identify with everyone else. There's a little bit of mechanical solidarity here, actually, if you remember Durkheim. So you've got lots of organic solidarity with all that complex organized cooperation, but you also have a lot of mechanical solidarity because people are actually being forced to become more and more alike. Okay, so let's go to the next paragraph. There's a paragraph that just says the same thing, but the next paragraph after that, the first full paragraph, second full paragraph on 476, the bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and has reduced the family to a mere money relation. Wow. Okay, now what Marx was seeing around him at that time was the children increasingly having to go to work in factories. So parents were actually separated from their children, and it took more children to repair the threads. So when they created the first weaving machines and spinning machines, the threads weren't really strong enough for the machines. So you needed lots of children with little nimble fingers to repair the constant threads that would get broken as the shuttles went back and forth across, and as the spinning jenny spun, 50 or 100 or 200 spindles of thread at a time. And so actually there was more work for children than for adults. So many parents were sending their children out into factory work. And so it appeared that rather than there being a breadwinner who brought back earnings and supported, usually it'd be a male breadwinner supporting a wife and children, it was every person for herself or himself. The women were going to be dragged into the factory, the children were going to be dragged into the factory, the adults were going to be dragged into the factory, and so the family would no longer be a coherent thing. Well, that's horrible. That is, when those of you who talked about an institution that mattered to you, it was not 100%, but I'd say 85% of you, maybe a little more, said your family was the most important institution that had mattered in your life. But Marx is envisioning a world where that gets destroyed, basically. People can't afford, they don't have enough wages to support a family, so there really aren't families. And in that world, it's incredibly destructive, might lead to revolution or rebellion just because of the damage it does, but it also frees you. Why don't people rush to the barricades, become revolutionaries, fight the system? Well, one reason is because they have to go home to their children. Actually, during the anti-Vietnam War protests, these people, the Berrigans, played a big role, and they were Catholic priests. And one of their amazing strengths as radicals is they didn't have any children. And so they could take risks that responsible parents just don't take. Responsible parents just don't go out and get themselves shot by the police for their political values, because they would leave their children at home. Well, you don't have children, you're freed up to be more of a revolutionary. But there's another part, which is, and this is very, Marx is a scary, fascinating, important thinker, but the thoughts he's having are not like, oh yeah, your life is great and you just need a little more income. That's not what he thinks. So what's the problem with the family? It's that to the degree that your family is what really matters to you, and your house, and your picket fence, and your pet, and your little life, you are limited in your ability to identify with humankind. And in fact, when a revolutionary struggle comes, you might well say, as workers do when they cross the picket line during a strike, look, I have to feed my kids. It's all very well and good to be a member of the revolutionary working class. It's all very well and good to be a member of the union. I want this, I believe in it, but I just can't do it. I've got to take care of my family. I've got to pay my mortgage or I'll lose my house. I've got to pay my family's food bills or we don't eat. I've got to buy food for my dog or that dog will starve. Well, if capitalism works so that you don't have a family and you don't have a house And you don't have, in Marxist terms, specialized skills, so you're not protecting your particular job. You have a lot more reason to identify with all other workers. Because the thing that, your particular little place in the world that keeps you safe, that gives you the sense that you don't really have to identify with all of humankind. You can just keep your little pod safe. That's, in Marxist sense, capitalism is going to destroy that. It's not that it'll be pretty or that you would want that. You don't want it. But it's going to happen anyway, and it's not that capitalists want it. They don't want it. He believes that the dynamic of competition under capitalism will force capitalists to drive down wages, and that all of this will happen. Okay, then I'm not going to read you every paragraph, but these wonderful passages where he talks about the universalization of national differences. So he says consumption will become the same. He really foresees the idea that in Beijing, in Jakarta, in Lilongwe, Malawi, in you name it, everywhere in the world, people will all be wearing Levi's. They'll all be eating Chinese food. They'll all be, you know, in his terms, this will universalize. They'll all be speaking the same language. I don't think he really anticipated that it would be English. It may end up being Chinese, not English. But we are moving increasingly toward a vast global monoculture. I go to some little village in Malawi, and I'm telling you, these things, there's no road. You walk for 45 minutes on a little dirt path to these little, there are no toilets, there are holes in the ground. If you're lucky, that is called a pit latrine, and you squat over it. And they ask how they could get an iPod. I mean, you don't think there's a universal civilization driven by capitalism? Then you're blind. He's absolutely right. And he believed that in the long run, all the differences in national, he has this amazing thing about breaking down old Chinese walls. And what he's talking about is the drive of capitalism to enter new markets. And so the Japanese tried to keep out the British, and they succeeded for, I don't know, 50 or 100 years. And then militarily, they just got their wall knocked down. They couldn't, the Chinese couldn't keep out this force that was determined, this was imperialism. It was determined to knock down barriers, and this is incredibly destructive. It's destructive of local customs, local languages, local religions, local civilizations. If you look at Survival International or something, you know, languages are disappearing as fast as species are at some incredible rate. But what is that doing? It is creating a universal humankind. That's right. In Marxist terms, everything you might value, your religion, your nationality, your ethnicity, those are things that divide you from other people. And he believes that in the long run, he didn't write specifically about race in this way, but I'm sure he believed that if what people were sitting around saying is, oh, I'm a person of color and you're white, or I'm white and you're a person of color and so I'm better or worse, in the long run, that's going. In Marxist terms, that's going. And you can make a lot of it in the short term, but in the long term, you're going to be part of a universalized humankind, and capitalism is driving that. So it destroys property, creates a universal humanity. Then, I have to finish this before I get to that, and I might not get to that. So what is it then that why is it that the proletariat can be the final class, and in capitalism alone, the most oppressed class is going to be the class that rebels? Well, let's go back again to that image, which I erased already, but of the serfs and the bourgeoisie and feudalism. And what was the class that overthrew everything? The rising class that controlled a new mode of production, not the most oppressed class. But for Marx, the new mode of production under capitalism is pure cooperative social labor. And those immiserated, impoverished, that's his word for impoverished, immiserated impoverished, universalized proletarians who have nothing left but their labor. They don't have their own tools, they don't have their own families, they don't have their own houses, they don't have their own professions. They are the new mode of production, which is pure cooperative social labor. And in his view, capitalism will fall during crises, actually, like the Depression. He, of course, wrote way before the Depression, the Great Depression. I'm talking about the one it starts in 1929 and engulfs the whole capitalist world. There were crises after crises after crises like that. So the Great Depression was a predictable feature of the way capitalist systems worked, maybe still work. And the image is the following. You have these workers who have been brought by capitalism to a peak of cooperative activity in the factory, but in completely alienated form. They don't control that. In fact, they can work and cooperate with each other only when the capitalist is making a profit. And the structure of capitalism is such that it drives toward this crisis in which the capitalist can't make a profit, so the capitalist lays off all the workers. And you have a huge factory with piles of raw materials sitting on the grounds rotting. The gates are shuttered, maybe imagine they didn't have this in Marx's day, but chain link fence around the whole thing. The workers outside, they can't work. And their families are starving, they have no wage. And their families need the shoes that this factory would produce, the food that that factory would, I know factories don't produce food, but they process it. The building materials that the other factory would produce, the clothing that the other factory would produce. And none of them can work. This actually is pretty much what happened during the New Deal. You had farmers slaughtering tens of thousands of pigs because they couldn't sell them. And you had people starving in the cities for lack of food. You had apples going to rot on the ground because it didn't pay to harvest them. You had workers who wanted to work. So Marx's idea is that this universalized humankind would tear down the gates and would say, we run the factory for the benefit of humanity. And so we don't need profit to keep our social cooperation going. The fact that the social cooperation continues only as long as there's a profit, that's the alienated form of human cooperation. The unalienated form is when humankind itself, human beings, recognize that it's their cooperative social labor that is the powerful new mode of production that is being held back by the fetters of the old social relations of production, which for him are the private property laws that mean that the factory can run only when the capitalist is making a profit. Those become the things that are holding back the productive potential of all of humankind. And that's why you're going to get a revolution. That is Marx's theory. So if you really understand the role that a universalized humanity plays in this theory, then you can understand why only under capitalism the most oppressed class and the class with a powerful new mode of production in its hands are the same class. And that's why he thinks basically end of human history. Now, I don't want to talk about whether his ideas about communism are realistic. I'm going to, in my last minute, say just one word, and I see I can't say much about this, and I will say something in maybe the last lecture or next last lecture of the course. I'll come back to these issues. But I do think, this is in the PowerPoint and you can think about it on your own, Marx certainly didn't anticipate that capitalism would emerge within nation states that regulate its most destructive possibilities. So it's very clear that capitalism functions as well as it does because there are laws that protect private property, there are courts that adjudicate disputes, there are antitrust regulations that keep capitalism competitive. There are things like the Federal Reserve System and the International Monetary Fund and the this and that try to smooth out the problems of capitalism and keep capitalists from destroying themselves. But what we do not know is whether if there were global capitalism that operated outside the constraints of any nation state, would unregulated competition begin to produce some of the effects Marx predicted, where there's no safety net, there's the country that can offer the lowest wages wins, there's no regulation of immigration, you drive wages down to the lowest. We do not know this. I'm not saying that's true. I'm just saying we don't know, and we don't know whether the global system will produce a regulatory regime that can have any restraints on capitalism at all. We do not know that. We don't know whether the global regime will be able to regulate business cycles, these huge troughs of depression, and we don't know whether universal humanity versus national, regional, ethnic, religious differences will triumph in our historical era. Okay,